Good morning, everybody. I'm Ian McGuinness, and I head up the geospatial function within Knight Frank Research. So Knight Frank is a global real estate consultancy. We have 18,000 members of staff in 55 countries, and in the US, you may know us as Newmark Knight Frank. We also have a strategic partnership here with Douglas Elliman. So I'm here to talk to you today about cars and car parks. So this kind of links in quite nicely with some of the themes that we were looking at yesterday. The movement of people into cities, development pressures, and the use of data in defining these needs, sustainability very broadly, and a specific link to human behaviors, human perceptions. So to back up a little bit, I'm going to just cover how has geospatial and geodesign found a home in land and property. So we've used geospatial as a tool to explore and a language to explain all of the interconnected facets of the property industry. And we use it to understand the movement of wealth and capital from a global scale right down to neighborhood level, where we use it to understand how all of our different property agency teams, who are covering different thematic submarkets, are all sharing the same physical space. So it allows us to arrive at informed conclusions about those spaces and how all of those intersections can be articulated. We also use geospatial to bring new insight and new understanding to bear in ways that it's just not possible using any other type of approach. This type of information is what you would traditionally associate with a real estate consultancy. This is London, and in the centre you can see the glowing core of prime central London, where the residential property market peaks at around £8,000 per square foot. So it's we call it the rich person's playground. But having products like this has helped our agency teams rethink the way that they approach their markets. So if you imagine a set product type with fixed construction costs, and you move it around this map, it will succeed or fail based on its location. And that concept has now taken hold in our different agency teams as to how they visualize their markets. The other thing to say about this is that this shows the price per square foot values, which is really only the manifestation of all of the considerations that have led to that market valuation. So we see this as the what, and geodesign lets us go further upstream to understand the why. So we have built all sorts of data sets and methods around big data to help us see into property market opportunities and constraints. This one in particular is quite relevant to this project, so I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to this. This is the Land Registry National Spatial Dataset. The Land Registry in the UK safeguards property ownership, freehold and leasehold, and they secure £7 trillion worth of land and property in the UK. So these records are extremely important in understanding opportunity and constraint. But the use of this enormous kind of beastly data resource is only relatively new. And from a consultancy point of view, we've had to invest a lot in the systems and scripts and architecture that can actually manage this information resource and surface up some useful findings from it. You can see here that we use it to understand density by relating it to Ordnance Survey building curtilage data to look at site efficiency. And we also use it in assessing 3D development potential in ways that were very similar to what we looked at yesterday. We've used this data resource to build up ownership portfolios for a huge range of institutional clients and organizations and asset holders. This particular map shows every part of the public sector that owns land within Greater London. So that's central government agencies, local authorities, and arm's length agencies as well. Now, it's quite surprising, but this single picture did not exist before we created it, because the way that the public sector works is that each department will be responsible for their own assets, their own portfolio. So this was the first time that we had a single big picture view on what was the holistic land ownership picture like in the UK. Now, this brought us to the attention of the UK's housing ministry, who needed just such a product in order to make sense of opportunities and to work out what levers they could pull to accelerate housing delivery in the UK. To give you a bit of a background as to the priorities for the housing ministry, for all the reasons that we've covered yesterday, the development pressures in the UK are really quite significant. And the housing ministry has a target to deliver 300,000 units per annum. Anything less than that leads to all the problems that we talked about yesterday about artificially high prices, bottlenecks, chokeholds around our cities. We really do need to deliver in order to match the demand to avoid the continuation of the affordability crisis that we have right now in the UK. So the housing ministry wanted to know, of all its government stakeholders, where could it actually secure sites through the government estate? So the housing ministry goes to the government departments and says, please can we have your surplus land? These are the stakeholders who were feeding into that process before this particular project. Now, these organizations all behaved as any organization would. They said, well, this is our operational land. We need this. You know, we'll give you maybe 3 sites a year. This was clearly far less than what the housing ministry needed to actually deliver to stimulate this market. And they didn't have a big picture. So you can see how the information that we had developed helped inform that. But outside of this need, there are all sorts of changes in how we conceive of cities and the spaces within them that also bore on the housing ministry's decisions around how they would proceed with this analysis. So in the UK, we have a number of policies that have just been put in place around electric vehicles. We know that by the end of next year, the London ultra-low emissions zone will be extended out to the outer orbital route, meaning that if you own a petrol car in London at the end of next year, it will cost you £12 to take that car off your driveway. So that's a really big motivator for people to look at their behaviors and to think about how they commute and whether they actually need a car. The other piece of research informing their thinking on this was the ONS National Travel Attitude Survey, which suggests that 75% of people in the UK now believe that we should be reducing personal car ownership as a result of environmental concerns. So these are really big changes in how we're thinking about car use. The government has also announced that by 2033, we will no longer be selling petrol or diesel vehicles in the UK, again prompting a complete rethink of the way that we use and indeed own vehicles. So how do we go about actually assembling this view of stakeholder assets? We convened a number of workshop sessions and got all of these government departments around a table to decide, well, what makes a development site suitable if it's a car park? The most obvious concern is that if you remove a car park from a town centre, you damage the retail provision that you have at that location. It's a fine, balanced consideration. So we worked with a parking consultancy that advised us on some of the economics of what makes a car park work, and particularly what makes a multi-story car park work. So this differentiation that you see on the map, this is one of the commuter towns that serves London. You can see that the pink parcels are actually car parks that are large enough to support both multi-story car park and high-density resi on the same location. You can also see that each of these car parks is about a 5 to 10 minute walk from Southend Victoria Station, which serves London on the commuter line. So the opportunity to provide high density housing at these locations is quite significant. We can also see across the government estate, and we can see where there are redundancies in provision at the same location. Same way as we started off doing this exercise with our own agency teams, we're now doing it across government departments and local authorities. They did not have the ability to see into each other's portfolios. In the workshop session, we also helped to iterate all of our findings through a web application that we built. We introduced as many different government property data sets into that as we could, including a central government database called EPIMS, which shows where every government department has a lease, and also a database that has recently been released by Homes England called Land Hub, which is showing where there are surplus government land. Land Hub is particularly exciting because Homes England has delivered that as an API, and we can drop it straight into this web application. They're also using Esri technology, so it makes the whole process really seamless. And by reflecting this back to our Housing Ministry stakeholder, we're also able to highlight good practice within Homes England in developing these kind of spatial data resources that can be very easily shared around industry. We brought in all of our valuations data. This is showing the price per square foot, characteristics around this location, and obviously we can relate that to the individual car park assets that we've identified and rank each one accordingly. But we also brought in some data that we're developing on a completely parallel track. So this is information that we have prepared for the Prince's Foundation Trust on what provides the baseline community infrastructure that you need to deliver sustainability at a given location. So we're trying to get housing developer clients of ours away from this idea that you must go outside a town centre to find land that's suitable, that you need a blank canvas to actually deliver something that's sustainable. We're saying we need to completely rethink that. The areas that are glowing on this map are actually showing you where you have overlapping community infrastructure within a walkable distance that should really guide your decisions on location. And you can see there the intersections between the car parks edged in white and those areas where you have all of that pre-packaged community infrastructure. We also introduced data that we created on the local plan framework. Now, I think we covered this yesterday, and it was the general plan. In the UK, these are adopted for a 5-year period, and they're relatively rigid once they're adopted. It's only in very special circumstances that you can deviate from them. What we learned in trying to pull together all of this information completely evolved our understanding of the taxonomy around the production of general plans in the UK. So you have a housing allocation, and then in the neighbouring local authority, you have a strategic housing site. Are they the same thing? Well, you have to dig around in an appendix to find an exact definition. And the point that we're reflecting back to the Housing Ministry is that the developer clients that we're dealing with will be making decisions at scale. Everything about this spatial data-led approach needs to be scalable. And in order to do that, we need to not only look at the quality of the spatial data, but of the taxonomy around that allows you to actually bring all of these information sets together. Now, we covered some of these themes earlier in Helen's presentation. You can see we've got various planning constraints articulated in amber, and opportunity zones of some description highlighted in green, and various flood risk zones and other environmental considerations that come into play. We've also layered in political considerations that have a very strong bearing on which sites you can bring forward. This one shows the constituencies that changed hands between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in the December election. Now, the reason why this was significant from a delivery point of view is because in some of these constituencies, it was the first time that they had ever voted Conservative as a constituency, meaning the Conservative Party needs to work extra hard to maintain a foothold. So we've seen this before when constituencies are transferred between political parties, that the messaging and the good news stories and the investment tend to be associated with these locations. So they're a very important component in considering where we want to design in the success stories for both the central government departments and the local authorities that are looking forward to bring these sites forward. The other new tool that forms part of the government approach to development is the housing delivery test. I don't know if you have a similar concept in the US, but those local authorities that are not delivering their share of that 300,000 unit target per annum are now essentially being placed in special measures if they're not bringing forward enough sites. In the last fortnight, we've just had the first release of which local authorities are judged to be failing by those criteria. And what that means is in those particular local authorities, the planning teams themselves don't have so much of a say going forward as to what gets built. If it's considered sustainable development, it will be pushed through. It's completely unprecedented that we've had that kind of a situation and that kind of a regime put in place, but it gives you a sense of the urgency around delivery on housing. So how do we make sense of the opportunity at a very granular level? We looked at using machine learning techniques that are present within ArcGIS Pro to really get down to a very granular level with this type of data. This is the image classifier tool in ArcGIS Pro. It was a lot of fun to get to grips with. We were able to rasterize aerial images such that we could introduce some training shapes. You can see them there. We can identify what's a car park, what's a car, what's a shadow, what's a building. And then we can let it have a go at actually automatically classifying those features. Now, the need for this is pretty self-evident when you consider how many government car parks we uncovered. The previous Department for Transport estimate in 2014 suggested about 14,000 car parks, and our study identified 36,000. So many of these car parks have literally been lost down the back of the sofa. These are car parks tied in with local authorities, with government arm's length agencies, and with central government departments that they can't necessarily see through the same tools and at the same scale. So the need to make sense of the opportunity within those at scale absolutely necessitates that we use some kind of machine learning driven approach. And here is one of the prototype attempts to classify the cars. Now, we don't see nice, neat shapes when we look at that as geo practitioners. But what we're more interested in from a design point of view is the percentage difference when we then actually manually count each of those cars. What we were very pleasantly surprised by, as you can see here, a test case where there's a 1% difference between the area used by cars and essentially the empty space within the car park. So the big picture view that we're able to generate with this analysis shows that by fine-tuning all of those criteria that the stakeholder group were deciding on, how close does it need to be to transport? Is it serving primary retail or secondary retail or no retail at all? We have balanced those criteria at this 15% mark, which takes a slice of about 4,000 of those 36,000 car parks and says on the criteria that the stakeholder group was able to iterate through multiple versions of this research, we were able to arrive at this figure of 4,000 representing 15%. Now, the location of these, you can see on the map, is acutely correlated with areas of chronic unaffordability in the UK. And not only that, but we can say that they tick all the boxes on the basis of their location. Is there prepackaged community infrastructure? Do they have a walkable distance to a station that actually connects you with somewhere that you need to work? We have determined, using the government's own brownfield density guidelines, that you could accommodate more than 100,000 units just on this 15%. So that's a third of the total target sitting on brownfield land right now that, as I said earlier, each of the government departments are saying, well, it's operational land, but actually when you take a big picture view, you can see all of the redundancies that exist in those assumptions. Now, the outcomes of this research, what we've been very clear on in this entire project and with this entire approach is to make sure that where we see good practice around spatial data use in the public sector, we have to make a lot of noise about that. We see that very much as a responsibility of a consultant to government, because we're aware that a lot of great practice in spatial data creation occurs in pockets of the public sector, and there isn't always a lot of visibility around that. That's why we've made a lot of noise about the quality of the land registry data that was used in the assumptions behind this. When they developed the national spatial data set, they never envisioned that it would be used for analysis and insight. We've also spoken to the Geospatial Commission, which is an arm of the Cabinet Office, looking at what levers can be pulled to really stimulate an approach to placemaking through geodesign. What we were able to say to them was about the potential value of the investment in the land registry data. The Geospatial Commission brought in Boston Consulting Group to kind of put a big figure on what kind of value could be unlocked in land and property in the UK if everything was working perfectly from a geospatial point of view. And the Boston Consulting Group, I believe, estimated between 1.5 billion and £2 billion of economic value through better use of geospatial data. Now, knowing where those 4,000 sites are and knowing the price per square foot and the gross development value, we can actually put a price tag on each of those locations, and we can work out that the 47 government agencies that sit on those 4,000 sites can potentially raise £6 billion in land receipts back to the Treasury in disposing of those particular sites for housing. So it is a potentially significant win-win situation for different parts of government, but the spatial data element is absolutely key. So our message to the Commission was that we may have significantly underestimated the total economic value of bringing geospatial data into the mix in working out opportunities. This was simply one project that potentially revealed £6 billion worth of value back to government. To consider that land registry and ordnance survey and other agencies still have to make really thorough business cases about why they want to develop certain data assets. It's all the more important that industry is speaking back to government about the value of this material when it enters the public domain. We've also spoken to the Royal Geographical Society and RICS in particular about the skills element within the public sector. So again, highlighting all of the good practice that enables this type of insight and analysis to take place. And we're very happy to see that in the last fortnight, the Royal Geographical Society in the UK has just issued new professional competencies for professional geographers in the UK, including the requirement to understand in a far more holistic way the operational and the commercial context of your work, whether you are a public or a private sector geographer. And we're really excited about what that means. That means we're stepping back from a situation where geographers are just solving problems within their own organizations. They're actively being encouraged now to look beyond the bounds of their own immediate mandate and look at ways to collaborate out in industry. And we hope that some of the lessons coming out of this type of investigation will help evolve that narrative going forward. I have to mention my team. We're a relatively small team, but I am incredibly grateful for the work that they provide in looking at all these different and very creative ways to try to bring spatial data understanding to bear. Anyone who happens to be in London for the Esri conference there, please do come and see Rob Holden, who's going to be speaking about the work that we're doing with the Metropolitan Police. Thank you very much.